I wish to mention in this important Africa Day Colloquium in the build-up to Africa Day celebrations on the 25th of May. The year 2022 marks the 20th anniversary of the founding of the OAU, which later became the African Union. The ANC commemorates this Africa Month with a reflection of the 20 years of the Africa Union's existence. As we do so, it is important for us to hear from those of our comrades who have been at the helm of the leadership of this august organization. It's a reflection that calls on us to pause and look back at what the successes and challenges have been, and what lessons we can draw on for the future. This occasion also falls on the backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is having wide-reaching impact on the continent. We are encouraged that the African Union's theme of the year 2022, as declared, is Year of Nutrition, strengthening resilience in nutrition and food security on the African continent, strengthening agro-food systems, health, social protection systems for acceleration of human, social, and economic capital development. The focus on the AU is spot on, given the myriad number of challenges the continent is faced with regarding nutrition and food security, and aligns well with the ANC's strategic objective to ensure that we build a better Africa and a better world that is free from shackles of underdevelopment and the legacy of colonialism, by establishing and sustaining friendship, working towards peace and stability in the continent and the world, and improving economic relations. Investing in the agricultural sector is essential in addressing challenges of food insecurity in the continent and our region in particular. Whilst pursuing this agenda, it is important that women are not left in the periphery. Women contribute to food availability through their role in crop production, enterprises, fishing, and agroforestry. Despite the significant contribution women make in agriculture in Africa, they have limited and inequitable access to the control of proper production capabilities and productive resources. Food insecurity requires multiple interventions. Firstly, we call on various stakeholders to also contribute to food aid to avoid devastating impact on vulnerable groups. Secondly, finding a sustainable solution that is inclusive of women in the agricultural sector. We all know about these challenges, but what matters is what we'll do to resolve them. That must rally us together towards finding common and sustainable solutions into the future. We must position ourselves to take advantage of the opportunities the international community is seeing in our economies. We ensure beneficiation over time. Undoubtedly, economic development is a necessary condition for the continent to achieve prosperity in its multiple dimensions. However, without peace and stability, those biggest victims are the elderly, women, and children. The Africa we want cannot be realized. We need to talk about complex issues which continue to divide our nation and rapidly address them, because failure to do so means we are regressing and moving further away from building and uniting our countries. Social cohesion and economic development require us to support the stabilization of regional blocs, and this requires that the state restores the capability, credibility, and the dignity of laws and institutions. Studies have shown that encouraging women's participation in community development service and programs greatly increases economic growth, reduces poverty and gender discrimination, enhancing sustainable development globally. Women and youth play a critical role in any country's development, and as such must be empowered to participate within the economic and political structures of society. In pursuing its foreign policy, the ANC-led government must accelerate and carry out the economic dimensions of South Africa's national interest within the SADC region, continent, and global community. In so doing, we'll prioritize Africa's economic development, industrialization, and benefits. As espoused in Agenda 2063, we must do more to ensure that we realize in Africa that continuously invests in research and development and advances new technologies in robotic, artificial intelligence, cyber economy, big data analysis, the Internet of Things, and augment realities in line with the fourth industrial revolution. This will be beneficial to improving service delivery, digital governance, Africa-centric technological innovations, and inclusion of South Africa and the continent in future economies. In conclusion, we must collectively work towards accelerating programs that are aimed at making Africa a conflict-free zone of the global community. Let's play our part in ensuring that the international community supports the continent, the continent's endeavors as it embarks on a path towards peace, prosperity, and economic development. We will be hearing from Professor Eddie Maluka on the 20 years of AU existence. Comrade Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma will give us a keynote, and Comrade Vasukoden will be the respondent. We'll have questions and comments, and then we'll have the closing remarks. I wish this colloquium all of the best, and I'm happy that we are now more needed. We're preparing for our policy conference that we're having this colloquium in Africa Month. Thank you very much, comrades, and you're most welcome to the Africa Day Colloquium. Without much waste of time, may I ask Professor Eddie Maluka to present or talk to us on the 20 years of AU existence. Prof.
Thank you very much, in recognizing the distinguished panel, the former chairperson of the African Union Commission, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, of course, and to send her very warm regards and the best, and really to recall all the work she did for our continent and the legacy she left that we are still working on, in particular the Agenda 2063, which she championed and left as a part of her legacy at the African Union Commission. I also want to recognize my friend, Comrade Vasu. I've known him for many years, and really to say it's an honor to be part of this panel. And Comrade Chairperson, you have already referred to Ukraine war, and of course, you will have also spoken about the impact of COVID-19. And these two events certainly will surely affect our countries and global trends in the future. However, Comrade Chairperson, let me just recall what you have just said in your own opening remarks, that the African Union was founded in this country, in Durban, in 2002. At that time, Comrade Nkosazana was the foreign minister, and that this year we are celebrating 20 years of this event, and to say the AU was born out of the OAU for a reason, as a transformative growth out of the OAU, and then to say finally also that as South Africa was at the center of this exercise in the negotiations, and of course at that time you recall that Comrade, our former President Mbeki, was also very central to the thinking and the transition, particularly the role that he played as a leader in bringing about what now is known as NEPAD, or is now known as OUDA NEPAD, and of course the organization where I work at the moment, the African Peer Review Mechanism, both of which owe their existence in large part to South African diplomacy and and it's something that we should always recognize. Comrade Chair, I thought that I didn't expect to be the first speaker, and I thought we'll have looked at the achievements and some of the other issues. So myself, I wanted to focus my presentation rather on the key issues that I believe are important if the African Union, as the African Union, has to secure its future. And when it comes to our challenges, Comrade Chair, I didn't also want to focus on the usual suspects of peace and security development, which I thought maybe they will have been covered, also some of which were covered in your presentation. But I wanted, because for now in my presentation, I want to view these as symptoms rather than they are the mega issues, development, peace and security and governance, but I want to see them in the context of my presentation as the symptoms. Rather, I want to focus on what I call the elephants in the room. And I've identified 5 for the purpose of our discussion and which we need to, even at the level of the ANC, to think through. And because if we are able to address them, then we'll be able to deal with these mega issues that are, of course, the core challenges of our continent, which are 3: development, sustainable development, peace and security, and then the governance challenges. The issue, the first one among these issues around this, the elephants in the room, is what I call self-reliance. I didn't coin the word. I'll come back to it. The second one is the role of, I want to say, the role of non-African actors on the African continent. But here we are referring to foreign powers, the role of foreign powers on the African continent. And then the third one is what I call the legal Tower of Babel, that the way the African Union is legally constituted and the challenges that this poses to the African Union moving forward and achieving the purpose for which it was established. The fourth one is the domestication of regional commitments, because we generate all these regional commitments, the decisions in the assembly, the declarations, even the Constitutive Act and all this forming, these constitute a body of regional commitments, and some of which, of course, are produced by the regional economic communities. And there is an expectation that member states will comply with these regional commitments. And the big issue there is a huge gap between these regional commitments, their existence, their legal status in the African Union system, and their domestication by African Union member states. And then finally is a concept that I call sovereignties. I also did not invent it, but I will come back to it later in my presentation. Comrade Chair, the issue around self-reliance is not new. It's about our ability as a continent to resource the development of our continent from our own resources, both at the country level and also at the level of our regional mechanisms, the African Union and the regional economic communities. It's a budget issue, but it's also an issue of you could say the resources for infrastructure, for currently the thinking, and it's subconscious, but it's really you see it quite a lot. There is this thinking that our partners are there, and they are there, they are assisting us. But until we address it to the extent that we are able to fund our own development ourselves, it remains a big issue. In the African Union, the funding of the African Union is disproportionately reliant on our partners. So the generosity of these other countries, they even build a building for us. But the question is, can we really continue to build, even the regional economic communities, even us in the organs, and across the board, the reliance on non-African sources of funding and even on infrastructure, it's just not sustainable. It's an issue that we need to address. And within the African Union, we use a formula in terms of the budget. Our budget formula principle is the capacity principle of the solidarity and the capacity to pay. So it's a system that's different, where countries that are able to pay, they pay more than those that can't, because really the issue of capacity to pay is not fictitious. It's real. You see it when you get to countries. There are certain countries that will not be able, that are unable to make certain contributions. But then the burden for the budget of the AU coming from the member states falls on 5 countries: South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Algeria, and in the past we used to have Libya there. Now Libya has been replaced by Morocco because of the civil war there. But it's an unsustainable formula, and we saw it during COVID when these countries were hit heavily by COVID, and it affected their payment of their dues to the African Union and the organs, and it was like serious. Even now, we have not recovered from that situation. And if you compare with how the AU and the EU, the European Union, our budget is focused on 3 areas. It's on operations, which is salaries, administration, and so on, programs, which are the activities, and so on, and what we call peace support. By contrast, the budget of the European Union is focused on development. There is a small part of it that goes into administration, but the chunk of it goes into supporting poorer countries and also issues around common heritage like environment, agriculture, and so on. So our budget is really largely around consumption and activities like that, but it's not really, the budget of the EU is not really oriented towards the transformation of the continent. And it's an issue that we need to address. And it's also a function of the source. Our budget is about 600 million, maybe at most. By contrast, the budget of the European, $600 million or so. By contrast, the budget of the European Union is over 100 billion euros. So you can see, and European Union is fewer countries than us. And the sources for the European Union, this is where it makes difference. 70% of it comes from member states, but they use a formula that is based on the size of the economy of countries. So they, like Germany, the biggest economy, contributes more. So there is a formula they have worked. So in our case, which is correct, we're using the principle of solidarity and capacity to pay. But in the EU system, they're using a formula where the strength of the economy, then there are obligations towards you. But in addition to that, they have a VAT system within the union where they are able to get money from. And then thirdly, of course, they get also from the customs revenue of products coming into the community. In Africa, we've been trying to do this, and you know that it has been quite a big issue. So we really have to look at the issue of self-reliance. And here I'm not talking about at country level, because if you go to country level, the situation is as serious, because most African countries, for their own national budgets, they rely on partners, what they call budget support. They are unable to fund their own budgets 100% from own resources. And it's really a challenge. And so if we're able to address this issue, and we need to have an approach as a continent, at the AU level, at the level of the REX, and also at the country level, because if our countries are able to strengthen to broaden the economy, their tax base, they'll be able to contribute more. The burden will be equally shared and all of. So this issue for me, comrade, I think it's a big issue. It really touches on the future of our union. The next issue, really, the next elephant in the room is this one of the role of non-African actors or the foreign powers. In my view, we will not get anywhere far without tackling this second elephant in the room. Depending on which angle, of course, we call them partners, and these are partners when they support our programs, and quite a number of them are quite generous and selfless in what. But some of them do more than that on our continent. They engage in other activities more than simply being our partners and supporting our programs. And some of our countries, and we know them, are trapped and unable to move forward because of their relations, historic relations they have inherited from the past. Some of this past could be colonial. So you find that the countries are unable to extricate themselves from this historical inheritance to the point that they are unable to make certain leaps in terms of development. Even you could talk about the governance architecture within those particular countries. So unless we deal with this issue of the role and the activities, for me, I think it's a big issue. And we had the Cold War, and Africa came out badly out of the Cold War, and there's a new Cold War looming. And we have to have an approach and to think through, even at the level of the African Union, what should be our posture? Now there was the Ukraine war, and African countries had to take positions and then had to vote even in the General Assembly. So this issue, we really have to think strategically at the 3 levels. And I think for us, there are 3 possible options. One is really tolerance of the status quo and somehow tacit submission to it and to see what the future holds for us. The danger with this approach is that we will bequeath to our children the same condition. Our children will inherit the same constraints that we have been living with over the last 60 years, especially for some of our countries on the continent. The second approach is, of course, to resort to a very strong anti-imperialist posture. And maybe it can go somewhere, especially among non-state actors, pressure groups, and so on, and the progressive forces, maybe. It can help. But in interstate dynamics, it's quite limited. And it's especially that these countries we are talking about, they are very strong and powerful individually and also collectively. And we've seen that they are able to mobilize their collective mind against a common challenge. And that collective mind, when it's mobilized, and then I don't think any of our African countries can be able to withstand it. So my proposal really is something that we have to think. It's direct strategic engagement with the superpowers. And we have to engage them outside the current model of direct engagement with them is this partnership forums. We have FOCAC, we have all of this, TICAT, and so on and so on. But these are forums that are more like the begging bowl settings, where we go, Africans who are asking for help, who are asking for this, and then this and this and that and that and that. And then, of course, we have forums where we are invited, like maybe the G7, we are invited, and then we come there, we put forward our issues. President Mbeki started it actually. It also has limitations there because we are coming in as guests. So I think that there is a need for us at the level of the AU to try to cultivate that level of courage and ambition to get to a point where we find a way for engaging with these partners strategically, but on these issues that we know about. The legacies and the constraints that the relations put on the African, because there are certain countries that are completely unable to move, and it's also linked to the issues that I raised earlier about self-reliance. And then the issue around the legal Tower of Babel. Here I'm talking about if we can imagine a country with a national constitution, that instead of amending this constitution to accommodate new developments or new changes, instead the country comes up with a second constitution. Then the constitution runs, then you have two constitutions running concurrently. And this is the situation at the African Union. We have the Abuja Treaty, which came into force in 2002. And when we moved from the OAU, and the Abuja Treaty created the African Economic Community. And when we moved from the OAU to the African Union, we came up with the Constitutive Act. But instead of folding the Abuja Treaty, we created a new legal basis. So we have concurrently in the AU two funding legal instruments. Like if you look at the first early protocol of the Pan-African Parliament, if my memory serves me well, the Pan-African Parliament was founded, derived its mandate or its existence from the provisions in the Abuja Treaty. So you find references in the Abuja Treaty, even in a lot of our instruments. And it's not a sustainable way. And I see it now when you, as a functionary, that we have this legal Tower of Babel. So we have many languages, and there are certain, like for example, we were supposed to create the Court of Justice. The Court of Justice is for arbitration among member states. But what we did, we lumped it together with the existing courts in Arusha, the one on international crimes and the one also emanating from the Charter on African Peoples of Human Rights and so on. So we put it there, whereas the Court of Justice is supposed to be for arbitration. It's like there is the equivalent of the ICJ at the level of the UN. It's supposed to be when member states or parties have disputes on the interpretation of the Constitution to go. So we don't have such a mechanism at the moment. At the APRM, we have had an incident where there was a conflict that needed a body like the ICJ to be referred. We didn't know because there's no such a mechanism. But we have these instruments running concurrently. And the EU, when they were at this stage, what they did is that they came up with an entirely new treaty. The treaty that incorporates all these elements, and you have, so it creates problems and it creates a legal challenge. And on top of it, we have the regional economic communities that are supposed to be the building blocks towards a full union of our continent. But each of these regional economic communities have their own founding treaties, their founding organs that are independent of the African Union. And what we have tried to do to try to create harmony, we then came up with a protocol to harmonize. And in this protocol, of course, now we have these media meetings. The next one will take place in Zambia, where the RECs, they meet with the AU and some organs and so on. But you go into the meetings there, you can really stick in the box, and it's more like information sharing and experience sharing maybe at best. So for us to really move in the next we can say 40 years, whatever, maybe towards Agenda 2063, you could say state, we really have to have the regs moving in tandem with the African Union and have one legal instrument that then holds this, all these bodies together. And it's something that we have to address, and it leads to the fourth issue, which is the domesticating continental commitments. Because the whole point is that when you become a member, like now in the ANC, we are members of the ANC, we are bound by ANC rules, and we have to internalize them as members. And if you deviate, then there are all these disciplinary measures and so on. Now in the AU, we have all these regional commitments, but for them to be domesticated, it relies almost entirely on political will. There is no legal mechanism or an institutional mechanism for domestication of domestication of this legal instrument, or this, you could say, this legal regional regime. So we tried, I remember with ECOSOC, when the ECOSOC was established on civil society, to try to say, now we must have the national chapters of ECOSOC. And even that did not work. South Africa, we established ECOSOC and it lived for that period when it was there, but it has fizzled away. We still have some presence of it, but in other countries, it never even took off. And then at best, you have within foreign ministries focal points, maybe a section or dealing with AU and so on and so on. But if you compare that with, I want to give you an example of two international instruments. One of them, of course, Comrade Nkosana, in fact, three, has been dealing with them. One is the Sendai Principles, that one that deals with disaster risk management. It's an international framework. It's an international instrument on how countries should relate to disasters and so on. But it has been domesticated through the National Disaster Act. So the national legislation that the Department of Comrade Nkosana's department has been, is based on an international instrument. And in terms of the measures and so on. So it's a legal domestication of an international instrument. The second one is international health regulations. The international health regulations, so that's why when we're responding to COVID, we use the national health regulation and also the disaster regulation. The national health, our national health component that was dealing with this, it emanates from the international health regulations. And then, of course, the third one, that's the one that we were asked to use to arrest former President Bashir when it was here, is the statute of the International Criminal Court. Even that is domesticated through national legislation. So and in that national legislation empowers the national actors and national institutions and compels them to implement and to implement this global commitment. So I think we need to have courage to move to that level of how that mechanism for domestication of these our continental commitments, relying entirely or almost exclusively on political will like it is today. So countries join and then political will, they do what they can in terms of the enforcement, in terms of compliance with this, including the shared values. That's why we have this unconstitutional change of government, and we are having difficulties dealing with it. We are relying on instruments. Even the actors within those countries, we subject them to such. But there is a weakness in how you cannot have the totality of our commitments relying almost, and not totality, almost exclusively on political will. Political will has its limits. It works when it works, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't deliver the goods. The time has come, I think, comrades, that we need not just a new treaty that incorporates all this and puts together all these things in the African Union, but then we need countries then to have national legislation that compels them to domesticate the commitments we make at the regional. So in that way, you are able to refer to national costs, national actors, to be able to get some results at country level. At the moment, we don't have such an instrument. And then the last issue is really sovereignties. And Samir Amin, in the 1970s, he reflected on this and then he called it monopolies. And of course, Professor Adedeji, the late Adebayo Adedeji, when he was at the ECA, he wrote about this, but he was talking about it more from the angle of self-reliance. And this is an issue that is going to be big in post-Ukraine war, especially in Europe. And as I said, he wrote about it, Samir Amin, in the 1970s, this, what he called the monopolies. And that enabled Western domination of the global system. Another time he said that the monopoly of control over global finance and a strong position in the hierarchy of current account balance, the monopoly of access to natural resources, the monopoly over international communication and the media, the monopoly of the military means of mass production, and of course the fifth one was the monopoly on ICT technology domination. So he argued that the Western powers are able to dominate and to sustain their dominance because they have monopoly over this. Of course, a little bit has changed with the emergence of China, because China also has entered this space in these areas. The Chinese and the Russian, before the Ukraine war, for comrades who have been following the thinking in China and Russia, within think tanks and also on the policy front, they have been looking at the same phenomenon of monopolies, but them they call it sovereignties. And there are two aspects to the definition of sovereignties. On the one hand, sovereignties refers to the essential or critical geopolitical resources that a country needs to enable it to engage in sovereign independent action in its engagement with other countries, and also in asserting to enable itself to assert itself on the global stage. On the other hand, sovereignties are also about the capacity of a country to deter other countries from harming its interests or the country itself. So the point here is that in Africa individually, and African countries individual and collectively as a continent, we don't have the sovereignties. We don't have the sovereignties. In Europe, the Ukraine war has raised this issue, especially for France and Germany, and they are thinking about it. President of France, he has mentioned the issue of sovereignties. He uses the word himself, sovereignties, that they need to go back and start looking at European sovereignties, because that war, the way it happened, so it reflects the issue of sovereignties in certain relations affecting Europe. So using what one could call a sovereignty index, Africa is the most vulnerable region in the world in terms of these 5 monopolies of Samir, to which we can add space technology and capacity to travel to the outer space, which is going to be a dimension which is going to determine the balance of forces in the 21st century. There is a lot of investment, and the Chinese are wealthy, they're investing in going into outer space. Outer space is a domain for the deployment of weapons of mass destruction. You saw even in the US, President Trump, when he was there, he launched a new dimension of the army, the space force, because there is a recognition that the 21st century is a period that humans are going now to colonize the outer space. And there are plans to set missions of no return to Mars. Space tourism is becoming popular. This is how it begins. In no time, we'll be seeing that it will now be easy for me when I go on holiday, instead of going to Cape Town, I'll go to the moon, I'll go to. So space is going to change and transform our concept of space. It's going to transform our concept of time. It's going to change how even international law will become largely a terrestrial element. Now we don't have a law at the moment that covers adequately activities of superpowers. But as I speak, and that's the point I'm trying to make, is that no single African country, South Africa now we say we're going to launch a satellite. Launch a satellite is fine, but satellite is still within our orbit. But no single African country has got the capacity to be able to travel to the outer space and also compete with others in the current dimension. So this is another area of sovereignties. That is where we are looking. And to this, we don't have a sovereign civil society. Our civil society is donor dependent, including the NGOs, because our countries are unable to finance them. We don't have a sovereign private sector. Our economies are dominated by foreign transnational corporations, some of which have budgets that are bigger than the GDPs of individual African countries. We also don't have a sovereign domestic politics. Many of our political parties are incapable of independent sovereign action, and many of our countries are vulnerable to externally engineered regime change actions. So, comrades, in conclusion, it's just to recall that the ANC was part of the formation of the OAU. We know our leaders were there, and some of our leaders who are part of this meeting were there even physically. And of course, the contribution of ANC to Pan-Africanism, I think at home, it's a debate that at home, of course, our own contribution and concept of Pan-Africanism got affected by by the issues around national racialism in the 1950s, and then we had a party formed as a Pan-African PAC, as at least is the owner of the Pan-African movement and Pan-African ideology in the country. Yet ANC has remained very strongly Pan-African in many ways. Because those challenges will always be there. For me, they are worrying, especially when you see ANC leaders leading from the front, making utterances that are not compatible with this Pan-African heritage of our movement, and also the Pan-Africanism and the family of Pan-Africanism and the AU values that we espouse. So, Comrade Chair, Comrade Lindy, I didn't go into the big issues around peace development and so on, but I thought I'm going into these 5, I call them the elephants in the room, but for me, these are the issues that I think they are the elephant in the room and the 5 elephants in the room, and I believe that for me, if for us, we have to secure our future as a continent and the AU as a center, we have to deal with the issue of self-reliance. We really have to have a direct conversation with the non-African powers who are active on our continent. We have to, of course, to fix our institution legally and institutionally, and also to empower our institution also to be able to encourage, to help member states to implement by domesticating this regional, because if more and more of us, our countries, domesticate this regional commitment, a lot of things, even unconstitutional change of government, will be able to deal with it differently. The current model that is predicated on political will, it has its own limitation. And I'm making an argument here that we need perhaps to move to try to emulate. I gave the example of 3 international instruments here. And so, and of course, the issue of sovereignty. Sovereignty is about capacity. It's about deterrence. And as we speak, not a single African country has the capacity to deter any power or any country outside the world from acting against the interests of our continent. I thank you very much, Comrade.
Thank you very much, Comrade Eddie, for those remarks and highlighting issues that are affecting our continent, including domestication, the issue of sovereignty, policies, and how we should bring them together. And I think it is important that African heads of state and leaders, different countries should come together and agree and on how together they can ensure that Africa becomes the continent that we believe it is, and the capacity that we have, how can it be harnessed so that we don't say one thing on one, they don't say one thing but act differently. I think some of the questions will come, but thank you very much for that insight and elaborate input that you have given, Prof. As I say, the questions and comment we will have after Comrade Nkosazana has given her keynote. Comrade Nkosazana, thank you very much for having you, and we're looking forward to sharing your experiences and the good work that you have done over years in the AU. Thank you very much, Ma. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Lindy. And greetings to all the panelists, the speakers, the comrades who are on the platform. A very good afternoon. Let me say it's very interesting that we miss time. I want to leave you, was not an organic movement in terms of proper discussions about where we should be going. There was an indication, purpose, but the AU was a reaction to what the late Muammar Gaddafi was suggesting. So if you are reacting, you are bound to come up with things that are not properly, as Eddie was saying, properly thought out. The late Gaddafi suggested that we must move from the OAU to the United States of Africa. And countries resisted that. But he pushed them to a point that they then said, what do we do to move away from what he is suggesting? Because clearly countries, especially the big countries like us and Nigeria and others, were not ready for a United States of Africa. And so we ended up with the AU. Insert 1999, this is where the discussion started, because the fact was that South Africa is free, Namibia is free. It was only Western Sahara that was still not free. And they said the OAU has actually served its purpose. Now let's look at ways and means of making this OAU effective to keep pace with political and economic developments taking place in the world, and the preparation required of Africa within the context of globalization, so as to preserve its social, economic, and political potentials. This is what was said. But so discussions took place, and eventually in 2000, there was the adoption of the Constitutive Act in Lome. The 1999 was in CERT, then 2000 was in Lome. And the Constitutive Act, if we look at and evaluate where we are, we should look at the 14 objectives which were establishing the intent of the union. Unfortunately, time that we've been given will not give us sufficient time to go through all those 14 objectives to see where we are. However, we'll just try to evaluate progress on a few key areas. Amongst them, maybe looking at poverty as well as securing peace, but maybe I won't go too much on peace now that I see Comrade Vasu is here, maybe. But let me say, then in 2002, the AU was launched in Durban. And I just want to say to quote President Mbeki, he said, by forming the union, the peoples of our continent have made the unequivocal statement that Africa must unite. And I want to stress, Africa must unite. We as Africans have a common and a shared destiny. Together, we must redefine this destiny for a better life for all the people of this continent. I close quote. Now, the content of that destiny is best captured by the vision of the African Union, which is an integrated, peaceful and prosperous Africa, driven by its own citizens and being a dynamic force in the global arena. This is the foremost yardstick by which one should measure the work of the union. But with regards to the eradication of poverty, because I think if we are to say whether we're making progress or not, yes, all the things that Comrade Eddie has discussed are very critical. But if we're poor and Africans are poor, of course, the paradox of Africa is still there. It's a rich continent with poor Africans. Africa is rich, the Africans are poor. And we'll come back to that. But if we look, for instance, at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development report on the African Continental Free Trade Area, it does indicate that there has been a decline in poverty since 2000, with a head count of people living below $1.9 per day, reducing from 50% to 34.4% in 2018. But of course, this was pre-COVID. So that was progress in trying to deal with poverty on the continent. But with COVID, of course, this has created more problems for us. And there's been a 3% increase in poverty. And estimates say that because of COVID, an additional 40 million Africans have been added to 478 million who were living in poverty. So I think unless we can address this issue of poverty, we cannot really say we're making progress for a better life for the people of the continent. So though we had recorded progress, the resilience and sustainability of that progress is questionable, because our continent is very little by way of social security. It takes one disaster to employment is a major contributor to securing a job, even in South Africa, doesn't necessarily translate to beating poverty, such that Africa has a significant number of working poor. And research conducted in 15 countries, on the impact of COVID-19, it concludes that 1/3 of workers stopped working during the pandemic. And the remaining 2/3 of workers who managed to keep their jobs, so their income decreased between 11.5 to 15.6%. Of great significance is that 60% of Africa's unemployed are young people between the ages of 15 and 24. But can the original progress recorded be apportioned to the existence of the Union? My answer would be yes and no. Yes, because collaboration amongst member states has increased because of the Union. Lessons are shared every 6 months as the Union leaders meet. The specialized technical committees, as well as organs and agencies of the Union, are also important platforms where lessons are shared and learned. But in answering negatively to the question, one would have to consider that the continent is also favored by an abundance of natural resources and commodities. Thus, the coincidence of the commodity boom over the past 20 years have accelerated growth and poverty should have actually accelerated growth and poverty eradication. The World Bank reported that 6 of the top 10 fastest growing economies were in Africa in the decade 2020 to 2010, and 5 countries in Africa in the decade between 2010 and 2020. But even the crisis of 2008 and 2009 did not really affect the continent so much, because the financial system of the economies of the continent are not fully integrated in the global economy. So, and this is also partially because the structural adjustment program of the 1980s and 1990s strongly reduced the key sectors in the African economy. These included the manufacturing sector, which led to the deindustrialization of Africa. It is therefore encouraging to see countries such as Mozambique, Tanzania, Sudan, Lesotho, and others increasing the share of manufacturing in their economies, such that its contribution is above 5%. In Mozambique, Tanzania, Sudan, and Burkina Faso, manufacturing led growth, with the sector in these countries growing faster than the economy. There are also African countries with high gross value addition, which is above the global average of 16% for manufacturing. These include Swatini, Zimbabwe, Egypt, Uganda, and Lesotho. There are also those who have high manufacturing potential, including Ghana, Nigeria, Mauritius, South Africa, Cameroon, Namibia, Cote d'Ivoire, amongst others. The African Growth Initiative says that business-to-business spending in manufacturing in Africa is projected to reach 666.3 billion by 2030. This is 201 billion than it did in 2015. So that's favoring Africa to capture the 100 million labor-intensive jobs that will leave China by 2030. Thus, the implementation of programs such as One District, One Factory initiative in Ghana are critical. The reindustrialization of Africa and the development of diversified industrial capabilities must build on its key natural endowments, which include sunshine, landscapes, diverse flora and fauna, to spur sustainable and equitable growth. Africa has a large share of the world's reserves in critical minerals, as well as oil and gas. 60% of the world's arable land that is still available is on the continent. And the continent is huge. We are 30.3 million square kilometers, enough to fit in the US, China, India, Japan, Mexico, and many European nations, including France, Spain, Sweden, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Africa is one of the largest coastlines in the world, which is larger than its landmass, with 70% of the countries, the continent, having extensive territorial coastlines. There are also 63 international river basins, with others landlocked countries such as Malawi and Zambia having extensive waterways. Despite this, Africa only accounts for 3% of the world's shipping container traffic, with very few African flags sailing, despite importing over 90% of its goods through the maritime highways. It is therefore our belief that in order to feed our nations and accelerate growth, we must deploy the strategic use of the blue economy resources such that they can catapult local beneficiation. And I agree with Eddie, because we have policies on the maritime policies, we have all sorts of policies, but as he says, whether they are in the end integrated into the national policies depends on each country. There's nothing that forces countries to ensure that they domesticate the policies and the agreements. And of course, it is also true that by promoting floating tourism, shipbuilding, and participation in full value chain of the sector, we can meet the elusive growth of 7%. That is, if we utilize all that we have, all our endowments, we can reach that 7% growth. But we are not utilizing all those. And even our intra-Africa trade is still only standing at 17%. And we are not investing in our endowments. Our minerals are still going out of the continent raw on the majority. In the main, they still go out raw, taking with them jobs, because where they are processed and finished, made into finished goods, that's where jobs are created. Taking away with them revenue, because by the time they are finished goods, they are costing manyfold more than what we sold them for. And sometimes we can't even afford them by that time. And I think it's also important to understand, I think what Comrade Eddie was saying, you know, many countries can't even draw up contracts with these multinational companies, because you may be a department supposed to have a contract with a multinational company. You find that multinational company's legal budget, just the legal budget of that company, is more than your department's budget. So you don't stand a chance in hell to really argue and make sure that you get a contract that takes care of your interest. And that's what we see in many of the countries that have these endowments, but the contracts favor the multinationals, and they don't favor the countries. So we could make progress, but we are not making progress, sufficient progress that we would have expected. If we look at agriculture, only 2% of students specialize in agricultural disciplines. This is almost the same percentage as Europe, even though agriculture contributes 13% to the African economy and only 1.4% to Europe. Thus, our skills revolution also ought to pay attention to the areas of endowment and comparative advantage. Thus, initiatives such as those undertaken by the AU University campus at the Jomo Kenyatta University's faculty on agriculture and ICT ought to be almost in all our campuses. By combining ICT, agriculture, we can make it more attractive to young people, and agriculture and agro-processing sectors. That university does both agriculture studies, but also agro-processing at the same time. To successfully do this, we have to pay attention to Africa's infrastructure. Now, Africa's infrastructure, I think as Comrade Eddie was saying, we're not putting sufficient amounts of money on our infrastructure. We almost completely dependent on investors. If they decide not to invest in that particular infrastructure, nothing happens. That's part of the problem in our continent. So ICT, integrated transport, spatial development, is not determined by us, determined by who invests in what and how. If we look at ICT in terms of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, the AU has adopted the Digital Transformation Strategy for Africa 2020-2030. The strategy seeks to guide a common coordinated response to reap the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. But according to the International Telecommunications Union, 90% of the population is covered mobile phones and 73% have 3G or better. But only 0.4% have access to broadband and 33% have either LTE or WiMAX. This means Africans are far behind when it comes to the information revolution. However, countries such as Rwanda, Ghana are at the forefront of Africa's information and ICT revolution, even though they were late adopters. In Ghana, for instance, the entire IT system is now online. Even your property is online, your driver's license, they are really moving. Even they are now using drones to deliver, to do medical deliveries. So they are really making sure that health insurance system is digitized. And in both countries, ICT is managed and driven from the highest office of the land. So it is possible to be in the forefront of these things, provided that, as Comrade Eddie was saying, there is a political will. Even where Africans have access, their networks are slower and cannot carry sufficient volumes. In Africa, the highest mobile download speed is in Morocco at 30.88 Mbps. The highest for fixed broadband is in South Africa. In both categories, the continent's countries fall behind the rest of the world because of low volumes, and take-up affordability on the continent is also an issue. Because of limited access to ICT, an integrated transport system is near impossible on the continent. However, in moving in that direction, key transport and movement-related flagship projects have recorded some progress. One such area is the implementation of the Single African Transport Market, where 29 AU member states, including South Africa, have signed the solemn commitment to establish the market. This covers about 80% of Africa's airspace, which when fully implemented, will mean better air connectivity and cheaper travel on the continent. So there are some areas of progress, but not as much as we would have liked. This will also better enable by implementation of the African passport, which was to be implemented by member states. Since the AU itself doesn't have the population register, as a leader of society, the ANC has to play an active role in this passport. We have an African passport, which could enable us, all of us, to travel across the continent without a visa. Countries are now supposed to then produce this African passport in their countries. And it was agreed that it will be an African passport, but it will say African passport Nigeria, African passport South Africa, just to know that the country that issued it is this country. But what has happened? Nothing. that African passport is there, but is not being utilized. And even ourselves as civil society, and we're not saying anything, but we complain about visas going there, visas going there, whereas the African passport could have assisted even people who should be traveling across the continent all the time, like business people and so on. They should be utilizing that African passport. I count myself lucky because when I travel on the continent, I use that passport simply because I got it from the AU directly. If I had to get it from South Africa, I wouldn't have got it. And I don't know what the reason is. So I'm just saying this issue that Comrade Eddie was raising of depends on whether the country is willing to do something or not, even when the AU has actually adopted it, is retarding our progress. Another flagship was the high-speed rail. You know, we are supposed to be building as the continent, Cape to Cairo rail, and also an Eastern rail, East-West rail. And South Africa is the champion for infrastructure. But on our side, we haven't really done much as South Africa. Egypt has done quite a bit on that. Working with Siemens, they've built about 600 kilometers of that, and they're going to be adding more, but they didn't start in Cairo, they started in Alexandria. But that rail should be moving, and it would assist us even in the Africa free trade if it was there. If we take the second one, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya have also begun with the East-West line with the assistance of the Chinese. So comrades, these are some of the things I just wanted to raise. We have NEPAD stationed here in South Africa, but I don't know now, but not so long ago, they were struggling because they were not even getting the proper accreditation here in South Africa in terms of, because South Africa was saying people who work in NEPAD must pay tax. Pay tax to who? South Africans who work in NEPAD must pay tax. And NEPAD was saying, NEPAD is an international organization. It doesn't tax. So it would have to be a separate arrangement if South Africa then wants people who work in international organizations to be taxed. But as NEPAD, things that we sometimes, all of us, not just South Africa, sometimes behave as though we're not part of this union. But NEPAD was a creation of South Africa and other countries who were leading. And they formed, it went through various stages. I won't go through that, but now it's NEPAD, now it's the Development Agency of the African Union. Now I want to just add to what Comrade Eddie has said about payments, contribution to the AU. You know, indeed, at some stage we tried to introduce, the AU tried to introduce payment in terms of percentage of your GDP, like Europe does, the EU does. But it was the big country that resisted. It wasn't the small countries. It was the big countries. They looked at their GDP and said, oh, if I pay this percentage of GDP, it means I'll be paying so much. No, they resisted. And I completely agree with Comrade Eddie that should be the case, really. We should pay. And that will assist, because even with the peace and security, we didn't even have a fund. We were busy asking other countries to fund even our peace and security matters, which means we're not really, we don't have sovereignty, as he says. And then we call them, we don't call them donors, we call them cooperating partners. But basically, we live on donations. And so I agree with him, we should contribute not only for the peace fund, but also for development on the continent. Because at the end of the day, there'll be no country in Africa that can reach its full potential when the rest of the continent is poor. No country will be an island of prosperity when other countries are poor. So we must have that kind of solidarity where we develop together and ensure that we are working together for the development of the continent, not the development of each country. So that's one of the challenges in the AU. Then, of course, when it comes to peace and security, peace and stability, I think Comrade Vaso will elaborate more on this, but broadly speaking, one can say that a number of interstate conflicts have drastically been reduced at the Union. What is happening now is the internal conflicts. They are the ones that are actually bedeviling the continent more than between states. It's within states where the problems are now. And of course, there are various reasons for that. I don't have time to go into that. But yes, the armed conflicts have been on the rise in various countries, but it's within countries. If we look at 2018, there were 15,874 incidents of conflict. But in 2019, we're up to 21,600, and I'm sure now we're even more. So that is one of the drawbacks in the continent. But of course, there's a comprehensive Africa peace and security architecture, which has greatly enhanced our ability to address conflicts. But it's not so great in addressing internal conflicts. I think it's more helpful in addressing conflicts between states, but it's not as well in addressing conflicts within states. We've also said that there can be no peace without development. And I think that we must take that to heart, because sometimes we say there can be no development without peace, and forget that in some instances, there'll be no peace without development. Because if people are hungry, they're not going to sit and fold their arms and die of hunger in one corner. It's not going to happen. if people feel marginalized and they are not part of the mainstream development, it's going to be a problem. Of course, now we are also facing, as a continent, not just South Africa, but as a continent, especially in this part of the world, extreme weather events because of climate change, which are also creating problems for the progress in the continent. But let's also just look at whether we are implementing Agenda 2063 or not. Agenda 2063, what is interesting about it is that it was not drawn by officials at the AU or by heads of state at the AU. It was consultation across the continent, consulting different sectors. And it was really a collective document that was informed by the people of the continent, not just by the AU officials or the heads of state and government. But are we implementing it? If we look at the report by end of 2021, which was the second progress report, it says that 51% of the 2021 targets have been met. These include progress on the continental, regional, and at national levels. This was far better performance than when the first report was issued in 2019, which only recorded 31%. So there is some progress, not enough, but progress all the same. Now, critical to the attainment of the goals in the building and strengthening of institutions of political, economic, and social integration. This also contributes to the culture of collective action when interacting with the rest of the world. Currently, 54 AU member states have signed the FTA agreement, 42 member states have ratified, and 39 have deposited their instruments for ratification. This demonstrates a high level of political commitment to achieving market integration in Africa. And this must be acknowledged as progress. A key driver of the growth will be the cultural and tourism sectors as well. The South African Cultural Observatory says that cultural economy is about 3% of South Africa's GDP, and it supports other mainstream sectors such as logistics, financing, and law. By promoting intra-African exchange and tourism, we can grow our economies whilst facilitating for a cohesive Africa. But there is an agreement that was reached on the free movement of people and goods. Now, if we're going to be having free trade, how are we going to do it if we don't have free movement of people and goods? And there are few countries that have actually ratified that, but it's going to be important if we are going to be really trading freely amongst ourselves. It's something that we have to look at.
Comrade Nkosazana, we're losing you.
connected. Am I audible now?
Now you are, yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I became. Anyway, I was just saying that despite the progress that we are registering on the economic front, human development remains a challenge for us. Always human development indicators of any region. There are countries in terms of moving upward.
You are muted now, ma'am.
What's happening?
Sorry, now, yeah, I can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yes.
I was saying that, but the light at the end of the tunnel is that there are some countries that are in the top 10 in terms of improvement of the Human Development Index. And those, and also there is also the education. African countries have made good progress in improving access to education and also in promoting girls' education, with performance closely matching that of India. In the past 2 decades, the policy organs of our organizations have adopted several instruments, but I won't dwell on that because I think Comrade Eddie has really dwelt on it in terms of how they are not enforced and people pick and choose what they want. And then when it comes to education, yes, there is access to education, but I think there is still a problem in terms of skills. And that's why the Africa We Want talks about a skills revolution, because the skills would actually assist a lot also even in the development index, but also in countries where there is inequality like ours. A skills revolution would be the fastest equalizer. Encouraging efforts are made to deepen democratic governance and public participation in member states, especially through regular elections of public representatives. Just this year, 18 elections are scheduled in Africa. It is therefore important that the AU organs responsible for the monitoring of these elections remain vigilant and plan and work together. It is also an area that the ANC needs to take a keen interest in, because it's one thing having regular elections, but it's another having true participatory democracy and having free and fair elections. Comrades, we've said before that our people are our most precious resource, and investing in them is very important. But not just in general, we must invest in all our people, but pay special attention to women who make up more than half the population and actually produce the other half. And therefore, it must be a priority. I think Comrade Lindy did allude to that we must really ensure that women are emancipated, women are integrated in every area of human endeavor. The Solemn Declaration on Gender of 2002 committed that all our countries and our union to gender equality and gender parity. And yet, only 10 countries have either reached or are close to reaching the target of 30% of women in parliament and cabinets. The second continental report on the implementation of Agenda 2063 highlights that only 39% of the set targets in relation to gender have been met. When we were at the AU, we did try to have what we called annual gender scorecard so that we could measure what's happening to women in various areas. I don't know whether that is still continuing, but we had found it very useful because it wasn't just looking at seats in parliament, it was looking at everything, the economy, agriculture, land, everything that affects. And I think it's something that we should do and make sure that women make progress. But also girls and women have been subjected to sexual and physical violence. But we are pleased to say that in the continent, it is dropping. It has dropped from 41.6% in 2013 to 21.2% in 2021. Similarly, the proportion of girls and women aged between 15 and 49 years who underwent female genital mutilation has dropped from 38% to 27%. It's still 27% too much, but at least there's a progress in the right direction. But it has registered smaller progress with regards to increasing the proportion of children whose births are registered in the first year. The aggregate values increased from 29% in 2013 to 46% in 2021. But we were hoping that by 2021, all children would have been registered, their births should have been registered within the first year. In South Africa, we tried to register them within 30 days. But on the continent, we were just saying at least registered within the first year, and we're still at 46%, which is not good. I think we can do better. And we must try and do better there, because if you are not registered, then you can't be planned for because nobody knows you exist. So it's critical to register the children within the first year. But we also strongly believe that the vision of the African Union can only be realized with the full participation of its people. It is the people who give legitimacy to governments, to the institutions, as well as to the vision of the future that Africa aspires to attain. Each generation, according to Fanon, must define its mission, which it must fulfill or betray. We have a unique opportunity to define the mission of current generation and the future we want to bequeath to our children and grandchildren over the next 50 years. The prospects of an economic renaissance are being threatened by the slow progress on our integration agenda. Slow progress with economic diversification and industrialization, and the continued fragmentation of Africa's economies reduces resilience to external shocks and perpetuates peace and security threats. This subcommittee has an important role to play in reshaping the future and securing a mission for the generation of today. We would propose a focused political program for the ANC, which prioritizes setting outcomes within Agenda 2063. Such programs we could build on with former liberation movements and take cognizance of the consistent opposition to the continent determining its own development agenda. We have our development agenda, but there is lots of interference from outside, which tries to distract us from our own agenda, because they want to impose paradigms and policies from outside. And of course, a major reason for this is our inability to fund our own development, which Comrade Eddie has spelled out very well. So who pays the piper calls the tune. So if we don't pay for our own development, those who pay for it will tell us which direction to go. Our less than sterling track record of accountable and people-centered governance, with perceptions that leadership and the national elites are not acting in the interest of their people. So this we should work at as a continent and ensure that our people, we work together, we direct everything together, that the people feel they are part of what is going on, and they don't feel that the political class, as they call it in many African countries, that the political class is only looking after itself. And we must open up the policy space and make sure that we have a voice in the international processes and fora, an African voice, not us being told by this one, come this way, and depending on how much they are going to give us, we go that way. We must have our own independent voice. But the impact of conflict and instability has meant a focus on symptoms rather than the root causes of underdevelopment and exclusion. So it's important that whilst we look at how to solve the conflicts, but we must look at what is the root cause? Because if we don't look at the root cause, in the end, we will not be able to deal with these conflicts and eradicate them completely. There must be a political will to move forward with the integration agenda. I don't know whether there is and how many countries have that political will, but with member states, regional economic communities, and other AU policy organs, since some of our member states belong to multiple RECs, but we really must have the political will to integrate. And integration means give and take. You can't just say, we South Africa, or we Nigeria, or we this country, this is what we want, and not be willing to give and take, because that's what it takes when we talk about integration. And as I conclude, I must recall how Africa came together during the Ebola crisis in the 3 countries. At the UN, we were told that 1.4 million Africans might die from that Ebola. But the Africans stepped up to the plate. Countries sent their medical and health workers to those 3 countries through the AU. The African business gave us money, so we didn't have to depend on donors, whether we can send people there or not. The African business people came together, gave the AU money to look after those health workers. And as a result, we didn't even have 100,000 people die instead of 1.4 that was announced. We had far less than 100,000 because for once, the Africans had come together and said, this is not going to happen under our watch. And I remember interviewing some young people who had volunteered, resigned their jobs in their countries and said they want to help. And one of them said, you know, I said, what if this was in Kenya and people were asked to come and help us and nobody came? So I decided I must go. Another one said, you know, we've always talked about Pan-Africanism and we theorize about it, but I thought this is an opportunity to show practically my Pan-Africanism. And that's why I'm here. So I think it's possible. It's not impossible to integrate. It's not possible to develop together. We must just tell ourselves we are going to do it and it will happen, and not wait for other countries. Because if we had waited in the Ebola for other countries to send human resources, to give us money, it would never have happened. But because we all rallied together, every country, small and big, rallied together, it happened. So thank you very much, comrades, for your attention.
Thank you very much, Comrade Nkosazana, for those remarks. I think they indeed, state what you referred to as the remarks that Comrade Thabo Mbeki said at the launch of the AU in Durban. It does indeed need us to unite as Africans and have a common and a shared destiny. Must redefine this destiny for a better life for all the people of this continent. You know, he raised issues of the first task being unity, solidarity, cohesion, cooperation among people of Africa and African states. And this indeed encapsulate what you broadly spoke about, broadened that his quote and what the launch of the AU was all about. I thank you very much. You raised quite a number of issues, specialization, the African passport, which many do not know about, and the peace and stability. Of course, Comrade Vasu will elaborate on that more. But also looking at the current the Sahel region, which is now becoming a bit unstable, but maybe we're looking a lot or reading a lot into that. But yeah, thank you very much. And let me not take the time of comrades, but gave Comrade Vasu to respond, and then Comrade can then add. And yeah, those who want to comment and put questions can then do that. Thank you very much, Comrade Vasu. Most welcome. No. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Lindy, chair of the session. Let me try respond to Comrade Eddie and Comrade Nkosazana. Let me start by joining Comrade Eddie in thanking Comrade Nkosazana for the vision that she has left us with Agenda 2063. If you don't have a lodestar, you don't know where you're going. And so I think this is a legacy, Comrade Nkosazana, you have left us with. At least with Agenda 2063, we have a vision and somewhere where we're going. Now, having said that, let me say that I agree with the sentiments. Firstly, I think Eddie has raised those 5 elephants in the room: the self-reliance, role of non-state African actors or foreign powers, legal Tower of Babel, domestication of regional commitments and sovereignties, all of which I agree with. And I think Comrade Nkosazana has given us both the progress that has been made on the continent, and I think sometimes we underestimate all of the progress that we have made on the continent. I like to see our continent as a continent that is in a state of evolution, and it's one that has been interrupted in its history of development and its evolving development by several different factors over this period of time. And if we go just back to 1963 and the founding of the OAU, and we look at the periods thereafter, we look at the period from 1963 to 1990, when the end of the Cold War, we will see that most of our liberation movements dominated on the continent, exercised some form of hegemony on the continent, and tried as far as possible to implement development plans that would take us out of the shackles of colonialism and into some form of prosperity. And that again was interrupted, as Comrade Nkosazana has said, by a structural adjustment, which I think was one of the most significant challenges that has left us with the deindustrialization of the continent. And if we look at today, not just the symptoms of what we are dealing with on the continent in terms of conflicts, but the root causes of our conflicts on the continent, they go back to the deep structural problems that we face on the continent. And in many ways, post-1990, with the introduction of multi-party democracy, something that we didn't anticipate was the sharp competitiveness in politics that we would witness on the continent. And a lot of this led to the kind of conflicts that we were witnessing. And Comrade Nkosazana correctly pointed out, we moved from interstate conflicts, largely driven by the Cold War and other factors, to intrastate conflicts, conflicts within states. Now, this is not an African phenomenon. This is a global phenomenon. We are dealing with internal conflicts in many parts of the world, and nobody, not the United Nations, not any of the other regional organizations, nor ourselves on the continent as the African Union or the REX, have managed to grasp how to deal with internal conflicts. We're all still on a steep learning curve in how to deal with internal conflicts. I think we've made huge progress over time, but yes, we're still on a steep learning curve, and we are learning every day on how to deal with these conflicts. The problem is that they are becoming increasingly more and more complex to deal with. So if we look at the OAU, yes, if we think about 1992-93, the OAU began to look at conflicts on the continent, established the Conflict Management Center. And one of the major instruments that came out of the formation of the African Union was the African Peace Support Architecture, together with a number of other instruments that gave us a more integrated approach to looking at peace and development. APSA for peace and security, the APRM for governance, AUDA-NEPAD for development, and now the African Continental Free Trade Agreement for trade. So if you look at, if we take an integrated approach to dealing with our challenges on the continent, and we look at peace and security, we look at governance, we look at development, and we look at trade. And if we're working on all of this simultaneously, then we would have a better chance of dealing with the major structural challenges. But what are the major structural challenges that we're dealing with? And despite all of the progress that we have made, the key challenge that we face on the continent is our rapidly growing population. It's a mathematical equation. Our population is growing exponentially on the continent. Now, it's not a problem for the continent, because we, as again, Comrade Nkosazana, when she gave the statistic on the geographic size of the continent, we're a huge continent. So we don't have a space problem in terms of being able to house this exponentially growing population. But that growing population is at the same time rapidly urbanizing. And again, rapid urbanization together with population growth is not in and of itself a problem, but rapid urbanization into unplanned cities with huge inequities, that is a serious problem. And that's the challenge that we face today. And that's why I said the deindustrialization of the continent was and continues to be a major challenge that we face as a continent. Why? Because if we look at the trajectory of development of other continents, Europe, Latin America, Asia, North America, etc., we see that as those continents were urbanizing, they were also industrializing at the same time. So low-skilled farm workers moving to the center could be absorbed into low-skilled factory jobs, and the successor generation to that generation moved into the services sector, now into the fourth industrial revolution. With us on the continent, people are urbanizing, but largely urbanizing to nothing. And what we find then is what President Mbeki captured in his 1998 speech, 2 nations. So if we look at the continent, what we see growing is 2 nations on the continent. The political elite, the economic elite on the one hand, having skills and capital, able to have mobility in society, and then that rapidly urbanizing circle and the marginalized rural periphery, that is the other nation that is steeped in unemployment, poverty, not having access to water, sanitation, etc. And even though we've made some progress, our development agenda is not keeping up with our population growth and our rate of urbanization. And that's the major problem that we're facing. So when we look at peace and security also, we now focus on that as the major challenge. The fact that that second circle around the elite circle, that rapidly urbanizing circle, that will be the major challenge. And that's where a lot of our internal conflicts are being driven and will continue to be driven. Now we've reached, and this is why I think this seminar was so important, is because we're in a very, very serious inflection point globally. And of course, that will have consequences and will impact on our continent. And that is because we have seen over the last few years a growing new divide, a new emerging Cold War amongst different power blocks in the world. But the Ukraine war has accelerated that. And we've seen once again, as Africa, we are being asked to choose sides, as happened in the other Cold War. And we have seen that we have not been united as a continent on all of these factors. However, President Macky Sall has indicated our position as a continent, that as a continent, we want to see a ceasefire and a negotiated agreement in the Ukraine war. But at the same time, that we know is not going to end anytime soon. And that is what is going to divide the world and bring to the fore all of those tensions that we have seen playing out on the continent during the First Cold War, now playing out on the continent again. And what Comrade Eddie Maloka has talked about, the role of non-African actors, external actors, foreign powers, etc. on the continent, we start to see that very, very graphically. In, for example, the Sudan conflict, we saw many, many new players, and to an extent, the marginalization of the African Union. We saw to some extent with the Cabo Delgado conflict also for a while, the marginalization of SADC, until as SADC were able to go back into the Cabo Delgado situation. So we are, I think at this juncture in our history as a continent, we have very, very serious challenges. And unless we stand united as a continent in the first instance, but in the second instance, unless we are able to utilize our natural endowments, both our resources, physical resources, but also our human resources, to finally come together and beneficiate those assets so that we have the resources to develop ourselves, we are going to be in grave danger. So I think, it's not just about being able to sit there with those resources and wait for others to come and exploit those resources. But as a continent, we have to find strategies and means to effectively negotiate better deals for the continent. We are not going to be able to beneficiate everything we have on the continent because we just don't have the technical capability nor the human resources capacity across the whole continent to do all of the beneficiation ourselves. So we have to go into partnership with others across the world in order to be able to do that. That's just the reality that we are dealing with. But I think that now on the 20th anniversary, as we face new challenges, we also face new opportunities. So if we look at COVID-19, despite all the doomsday predictions, we did have our health and economic challenges, but at the same time, we managed to forge a new Pan-African unity. And that has led to new innovative initiatives about producing our own vaccines, etc. Secondly, the war in Ukraine, as I said, will present us with new challenges. We'll be asked to choose sides. But at the same time, we also will be able to exploit some of the challenges that are faced globally by the major powers and use our own resources to reposition the continent. So out of this will come the opportunities. We can rise to those challenges, particularly when it comes to energy resources. About 40 of our countries on the continent will be oil and gas producers. And at the same time, we have all of the natural endowments also in terms of sunlight and wind and wave energy, etc., to be able to be part of the alternative energy. We can also use on the continent, we are home to 60% of the uncultivated arable land in the world sits here in Africa. So if we industrialize agriculture, we will not only be able to deal with food security on the continent, but we will also be able to export to the rest of the world. And then we have the coltan, the copper, the palladium, the platinum, nickel, all of those that can drive battery technology, which is going to be the major industry of the future. And here again, we have all of those resources here on the continent. And as the major powers begin to battle it out globally with the shortages of these commodities, Africa and many of the African countries that are endowed with these resources will have a boom, including ourselves here in South Africa. We've posted a surplus in the last quarter. The question is, what are we going to do with all of these opportunities that present themselves, including the 1 billion young people who could become the new factory of the world? So I think we have a lot going for us. And as the African Union, a lot has been done. We have a vision now going forward. So what do we need as a continent? And I spoke last week at the seminar on Pan-Africanism that was arranged by University of Cape Town, Western Cape, and DIRCO. And what I talked about is the fact that we have the structures in the African Union with APSA, with Outer NEPAD, with APRM, with the ACFTA. We have all of those structures. We have the resources. We have the natural resources and we have the human resources. But what is lacking is our consciousness. And what I call, we need a new African consciousness, very much like what we had in the 70s with Black consciousness, where we were able to liberate our minds so that we ourselves could feel that we had it within us to make those changes that were needed to be made. And again, I think what we need now is something akin to Black consciousness, but what I would call a new African consciousness, where we take inspiration from our Pan-African history and look towards a future where we can beneficiate all of our endowments for the betterment of our people on the continent. Let me stop there, Chair, so that we give others an opportunity to ask some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Basu, for your responses and pointing on what needs to be done and what are the realities, including the issue of the beneficiation that would seriously want happening within our own countries and the continent, but also due to limitations and the challenges of infrastructure and means that we will not be able to do all those things. Looking at the issues of the two nations in the continent, the developmental agenda, the African consciousness, which will enable all of us together to put Africa first and do within the continent before going out. Thank you very much. Thank you, Comrade Basu, for your response. Again, thank you, Comrade Eddie and Comrade Nkosazana. Comrades, I will now open for your comments and questions on the inputs. Comrade Molly, then others will follow.
Thank you, Comrade Chair, Comrade Lindwe Maseko, and greetings to Mam Nkosazana, Comrade Eddie, Comrade Basu, and thank you for the presentation. Key presentations that have been made that resonates with a lot of us that are here. I have a question, or rather a comment about two recent developments post the Ukraine Russia conflict. We are told that there's a United States bill that will oblige Washington to punish African countries that are aligned to Russia or to Russian activities and influence in the continent. And apparently this has received support in Congress, and it's now waiting for the Senate, I think, to finalize the Countering Malign Russian Activities in Africa Act. And for some of us, this might reflect a counter action by the US on any possibility of aligning with Russia economically and otherwise. For me, and for many, this looks like a Cold War repeat, where African countries will now be compelled to be on the side of the USA, whether they like it or not. And my question would be, how do we hope we can counter this? Because this is more than there's more to it, and we know that some countries were beginning to align with Russia, countries like Central African Republic and others, and maybe Mali, and we know that obviously France wouldn't be happy with such, and because they want to continue with a hold on the Francophone countries. So my question would be, how do you think we can prepare for this and also influence other African countries? And the second one is linked to this but different. The recent developments with regards to Zambia hosting the AFRICOM office on security cooperation. How do we hope to also counter that? Because it's also a threat to SADC, a threat to the biggest country economically in SADC, because we know that security and the economy these days is one thing, like politics and the economy. Thank you, Chairperson.
Comrade Molly, I see a handwritten TM. I'm not sure there's no full name. TM. Hello, Comrade TM. Okay. Okay, in the meantime, I'll have Comrade Chris Henry.
Thank you, Chair. My apologies for coming in late. I only received the notice very late this afternoon, so I missed the speech of Comrade Eddie. But I have a few comments on the lecture from Comrade Nkosazana, and my happiness and inspiration that she has mentioned about the African passport, and especially that many of us have not yet received that notice or information about that the possibility of getting an African passport. And this I've only heard in Sweden from a comrade from Eritrea. So I am very happy and glad that now we can even, as South Africans, move around in Africa and by that to strengthen our cohesion with our beloved continent. And I am especially interested in this skills revolution that Comrade Nkosazana has also mentioned, because that is a deep worry for me, that there are so many unskilled persons in our or on our continent, and that is also a matter of deepening this inequality that we experience in our different countries. And my last point is what I like very much is the participatory democracy that must be enhanced also in the minds of our people. That we all must participate in the conscious building of what we as citizens can achieve together on this beloved country of ours. And gender equality is something that we must build on, because there's too much problems and challenges when it comes to gender inequality. And that is something that we must build on and that we should strengthen on our continent. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Comrade Chris, for your questions. Comrade TM.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, I wouldn't know if maybe you can identify yourself because you reflect as TM, just TM.
Oh, my name is Tabiso Mthembu. I'm an international relations student at UNISA.
Okay.
My questions are two. The first one is, since Gaddafi was advocating for the United States of Africa, why was then at that time Africa not ready for that United States of Africa? And did this United States of Africa mean that the African continent was going to have one president? And then the second question is, how do we ensure that Africans stop being poor? so that we can end this reality of a rich continent but poor Africans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Thabiso. Is there any other hand? If not, can I ask the panelists, including the respondent, if they could come in on any of the questions? Okay. I see Comrade Skumbuzo, you've got your hand up.
Am I audible, Chair?
Yes, yes, you are.
It says the host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves. No, mine is just two quick ones. Maybe to Comrade Vasu. One is the issue. One is on the food security. 80 to 90% of global wheat trade comes from Ukraine and Russia. And about half of gas to Europe they support, they supply, and close to 30% electricity. Now, Egypt is entirely dependent on Ukraine for their wheat. And there's been a huge shortage of wheat all across the world, and it's increasing. In fact, as we speak, the US does not even have baby formula. They'll be importing, I think this week from Europe, something similar to that. Now, what I want to ask is, have we built enough resources, one as a continent and as a country, with regards to that? That's the first one. The second one tied to that, on energy, Comrade Eddie. Next month, we are headed for, I think, what will be a record fuel price hike. And it's imminent that we might, if this war persists, numbers like 40 to 50 rand a liter are feasible within the current financial year. Now, what can we do first as a country? And what can we do secondly as a continent? Because I'm of a view that while it's something that might be happening far away, its impact, I think, on our livelihoods, comrade leaders, is going to harm, I think, the global economy worse than, I think, the aftermath of World War II, Brady. So I don't know, maybe just something short around the energy securities that I'm raising, and as well as food. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Skumbuzo. Comrade Timbalimba.
Okay. No, thanks, Comrade Chair. And also to express my greetings to the panelists and the colleagues that are here. I have 2-3 questions just to ask. One, my first question would be, and it's from a social cohesion point of view, when you talk about the AU, and I'm raising this in line, just making one practical example. And I'm not too sure if there are, sports platforms or arts and culture platforms under the AU. I'm talking about the type of attitude and tensions that display themselves in African tournaments, which show some degree of lack of humanity or common values and so on. When you see how particularly countries that, teams that come from the South go to the North. And I want to understand as to, because in all incidents of sports, particularly football, which has got the majority support. You know, there are so many incidents that one can place on record, but there is silence, either by governments, individual and collectively, around such incidents. And from a social cohesion point of view, how then, if there are such, and in spaces where there's high population support or participation of citizens, there can be silence. But I wanted to check as to, do we have any instrument or what is the role of the AU, maybe in short, in the arena of sports to facilitate some cohesion, using that one to unite our people, because sports can unite people, and we've seen that with our own country with the Rugby World Cup and other previous sports. So that's my first question. Secondly, there were talks a ticket or so go around a common currency, whether in SADC or the continent. I'm not too sure if such is still on the agenda, but there hasn't been any talk, because the unification of Africa, amongst other things, whether economical or what, also talks to one currency, one what you call for the continent, and so on. So I'm saying I want to check if such is still on the agenda, and if yes, to what extent is it happening? None of the speakers has made reference to, unless I don't know how the institutions of the AU work, the African Parliament. At some point it was launched. I'm not too sure if it still exists, and we're the host country for such in terms of Midrand, if I'm not mistaken. But the point I'm trying to raise that do we still have such a platform for engagement and so on? And if no, then what would have been the transformation that would have happened to or where would have migrated into some of the AU structures? So those are my two questions that I just wanted to ask Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Comrade Mbali. Is there any other hand? Comrade, yeah, okay. Okay, I don't see any other hand. The questions around the prospect of reemergence of the Cold War, and also the issues around the Russia-Ukraine. There was questions on the African passport that not many know about it, the skills revolution, participatory democracy, the gender issues. If Africa is ready for being a United States of Africa, if not, why not? The issues of food security, issues of social cohesion, and there was a particular pointing to issues around sport as a unifier, and the one currency issue, and lastly on the Pan-African Parliament, what is the status on PAP that we're supposed to be hosting in Gauteng Midrand? Thank you. Comrade Eddie, do you want to start with any?
Yes, Comrade Chair, thank you very much, and also thank comrades for invaluable and insightful reflections, and also the very comprehensive reflection we received from Comrade Kozan as well as Comrade Vasu. I will just attempt to share my thoughts on a few of the questions. The ones that were raised by Comrade Smolly, I don't know, but Comrade Nkosana is here, but it's one of the issues that has to be taken up by the AU, but through the member states, because it's a real concern if you know, like another country legislates against an entire continent. So it's something that comrade, I know that comrades from DIRCO are here. Maybe they can share their thoughts, because it's something we do have. South Africa, we have our own bilateral ambassador there. The AU also has an ambassador in Washington. and the Africa Group exists there, to see what the Africa Group in Washington can do to engage our friends in the US about this. And because one of the advantage with the US system is highly contested. So even between the main political parties, but also among different interest groups. So it's a bill which is championed by some members of Congress, and I don't think it will be a futile effort if the Africa Group were to be organized and engaged and try to give US lawmakers a different perspective, and probably even now start engaging the State Department as well as the White House to see, because the president must still sign it into law. So, and I think and there is also the Africa-US Leaders Summit, which is coming, I think, later in the year. There is a committee there of experts and preparatory structure there. So I think the Africa Group could engage, and also with our ambassador of the AU. But, you know, comrades from DIRCO are here. South Africa is such a powerful country. If it were to engage and consider giving initiating some few steps in this regard, I think it may help. We've got an ambassador in Addis Ababa, and also comrade, the former mayor of Cape Town and the former deputy minister is our ambassador in Washington. So I think there are things that we can do practically, and comrades from DIRCO are here. There's also the same thing on the issue of Zambia. I think it will not be wrong for South Africa. I'm not sure where South Africa is now at SADC. I know we used to be in the organ. I'm not sure whether we're still there now, currently. It won't be wrong for South Africa to get to SADC at one of the meetings of SADC, just to request our colleagues in Zambia just to provide some clarification and information on this matter that was raised by, because it's not for the first time, something like this, it's in the pipeline in the region. So, and before I know that, there were some inquiries addressed to the member state that was looking at this at that time. So, so I don't think there will be any harm if South Africa going to one of the meetings or whatever, but there is a SADC mechanism, and within SADC, this can be an issue that we can raise, especially with Zambia, which is a very friendly and a brotherly country. So on the issues of Africa, the issue that was raised by Comrade TM on why Africa was not ready for the United States of Africa. I think this is a point which was raised by Comrade Nkosazana when she was taking us through the memory lane on this issue. There were debates there, of course, but I can say that one of the things that we did after independence in Africa, which is something that Kwame Nkrumah warned us against, is that when we get our independence, let's not invest in sovereign states, but rather in a continental body. And the OAU was formed in 1963 as a compromise, and a very weakened compromise of what Nkrumah and others like him had envisaged. So you look at in the United States, when the settlers in the US got their independence from Great Britain, they formed a federation. But in Latin America, when the settlers there got their independence from Spain in the 1820s, they went for independent sovereign states. We now have multiple of them. Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and so on used to be one country. In fact, Simon Bolivar he ran it as a president for a while. It was Gran Colombia. And Peru and Bolivia were also an attempt, very short-lived, to try to form them into, for them to be independent, one country. But of course, they had problems. Chile didn't appreciate it, and I think it was Chile and Argentina, and both countries invaded this new confederation. And also there was an attempt in Central America to set up the Central American Federation. Even that, it dismembered into different pieces, became Mexico, Guatemala, and a few other states, Nicaragua, and so on. And the same thing, even with the great so-called British India, when it got its independence, it split into two parts. So it's only one rare example. For example, Indonesia, which when it got its independence, it was actually the nationalist in Java. who pulled together the others across the islands and created a single country. But that did not happen in the French Indochina, where when French Indochina got its independence from the French, it was Vietnam that declared its first independence, but as a single country. Then Laos and Cambodia, then when they were. So what happened in Africa was not unique. That when we got our independence, we went into these sovereign roots. And once we have sovereignty, we have borders. We have borders. Then when we have borders, then we have citizens. When we have citizens, we have xenophobia. We now have national flags. We now have, and countries have 60 years of investment in the national state, in the nation state, sovereign states, and so on. It's not something that you can do away very easily. And I think that's where the challenge was, and that's where the challenge continues to be. That we invested enormously in sovereignty of the states, and it's not going to be something very easy. So, and it's something that we can undo. We have to find another model for trying to get the AU to be nearer to the vision of United States of Africa, and it's quite feasible. We now have an intergovernmental model, so we can move towards something much stronger, more a supranational authority. And so on and so on. It's possible with countries still with their own sovereignty. And then the issues around the African currency, I think Ghana is championing them at the moment. But when I was listening to the report of Ghana, and is that perhaps they are thinking of these financial institutions as physical entities, and perhaps maybe that's not the way we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about them as digital platforms. And that's really a thinking that some of us are arguing for that. No, let's not. We should create digital, because anyway, paper money is disappearing. We already use cards. So cards now will be using digital currencies. Even rent is going to be a digital currency at some point, and so on. So trying to go into the physical route of currencies and physical bank, physical monetary bank, physical reserve bank, it's an approach that was, of course, that's what we envisaged then, but perhaps we should look at a digital model. But this is an argument, a discussion we should have at the level and within the African Union. And the issues that Comrade Kumbuzo raised, the issue of the energy crisis, I think this is worrying. And I'm not sure the extent to which African producers themselves can constitute I know that the Arabs in the Gulf states are able to pull together their muscle to try to influence how politics around this domain. But I'm not sure whether in Africa we've been able, and quite a number of African countries are becoming important players in this energy space. But I'm not sure whether geopolitically we've been able to translate it into you could say, a geopolitical advantage. So I will just end there, and also just assuming that perhaps this is my last, it will be a last opportunity to talk, is just to thank you, Comrade Lindy, and all the comrades for really being part of this reflection. And of course, once again, pay tribute to fellow panelists, Comrade Nkosazana and Comrade Vasu. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Eddie. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your responses. And also thank you for availing yourself for enriching this colloquium. Can I have Comrade Vasu, and then I'll end with Comrade Nkosazana. Comrade Vasu, your responses or comment on the question?
Thank you very much, Comrade Lindy. Maybe I think the only one was addressed to me was the one on food security. Again, this is outside of our control at this point, both the fuel price as well as the energy, the wheat availability, because I don't think the world is prepared. I don't think we have the ability on the continent to meet the shortfall anytime soon. So unfortunately, there will be parts of our continent that will be in dire need of this basic product. And as it relates to the fuel price, I think we're all worried about what will happen. We can pray that somehow this conflict gets resolved soon, but I'm not very optimistic about that either. And then on the wheat, I think India announced that it is trying to close the gap. It's ramping up its production. Hopefully some of that will find its way onto the continent. But again, also let me take this opportunity, Comrade Lendi, to thank you and to thank the other panelists, Comrade Nkosazana and Comrade Eddie. I think more discussions like this are required because, as I pointed out, we're reaching a very, very critical inflection point globally, which is going to have serious consequences for us as a continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again, Comrade Vasu, and thank you for your response and also for being part of the colloquium. Comrade Nkosazana.
Thank you, comrades, and thanks for the comments. Let me say some of the issues Comrade Eddie has dealt with. If we look at why we were not ready, I think it's precisely that no country wanted to lose its flag, wanted to lose its place at the UN, and generally that kind of national state. So maybe only the late Gaddafi and a few other countries, there were a few that supported him, but the majority didn't. Were we going to have one president? Yes. If it was the United States of Africa, yes. Could have been, we could have had a federation or a confederation. But at the end, there would be at least one, if it's a federation, one president, federal president. So maybe it's all those things that stopped us from being ready. But I think we do need to unite in whatever form. I think we need to discuss this, debate it broadly, because we do need to unite and we do need to integrate, because together we can be a formidable force of strength, both for our people and for our continent generally. But divided as we are very weak. None of us are strong enough to do anything alone. So, as Comrade Eddie says, we must find a way, even if it's not the United States of Africa, but we must find a way. The wheat situation is bad, but generally, I think we must also change our paradigm as Africa. There is no need for Africa in reality to be importing so much food from outside. Besides wheat, we import a lot of other things, which we could be growing ourselves. We have enough land, we have water, we have sunshine, we have people. Now we just need to have the vision of how we feed ourselves with what we grow and even help feed the world. But at the moment, that's not the case. But I think we should draw lessons from what is going on so that in future, we will be able to be more sustainable and more food secure. I think they've answered on the other issues. On the African currency, yes, it was on the agenda, but I think again, for the same reason that we were not ready for the United States, we were not ready to have one central bank. But I would agree with Comrade Eddie that things have moved, the world has moved. Maybe we should be looking at a digital currency. But there must be a will to have whether it's digital or what, but there must be a will to go that route. The African Parliament, I think it's still there, but it hasn't moved to be a more powerful parliament that can make laws for all of us, that bind all of us. It's still not there. So I think there has to be a reflection of what the role of the Pan-African Parliament should be, and then try and move towards that direction. But otherwise, I think on the passport and all that, I didn't think there was a question. I thought it was a comment, but maybe I missed the question. If I did miss the question, maybe Comrade Lindy can just help me. What was the question? I thought it was a comment.
Yes, I think it was a comment, but I think more, I sense that the question was more about, now that we know that there's an African passport, what is it that we need to do as South Africa to ensure that it is that particular issue is implemented?
Well, we need the government to agree to printing the African passport for South Africans, even if it starts with those who travel a lot around Africa. But it will really be a useful thing to do, to print. In fact, even the African passport is printed here. When we were at the AU, we were printing it here. So it's not difficult. It's the will to do it that we need. Maybe as citizens, we can lobby the government to do it. There isn't much else. It's just to print it, because the AU would have printed it for African citizens, but we don't have the population registers of countries, so we couldn't do that. We only printed it for the presidents who were in place, who the current presidents then, and the foreign ministers and ambassadors. But for citizens, it was agreed that each country, because it has the population register, it's the country that can print for its citizens. In ECOWAS, there is such a passport actually. ECOWAS has an ECOWAS passport, which they use within the ECOWAS countries. And it's done like that. It says ECOWAS passport, and then it says Nigeria if it's printed in Nigeria. ECOWAS passport, Ghana, according to where it's printed. So we could do the same. And I remember when they were launching that passport, they had invited us. So what stood up for me, when they were advertising the passport, they were saying, ECOWAS passport, no visa, no bribe. Because at that time, people were bribing officials to get visas. So they were saying, ECOWAS passport, no visa, no bribe. So we can do the same if the government agrees to do it. That's all it needs for the government to print. But otherwise, I think for some of the students, we had also started what was called AU clubs in universities. I still meet some of the people who say, oh yeah, I was in the AU club, or was still an AU club, but there are very few now. I think it's something that we should look at the various institutions of higher learning, so that we instill the sense of belonging to the continent, the Pan-African spirit amongst our young people. It's just something that I thought I should add. But otherwise, I think this was very interesting. Like Comrade, I think it was Comrade Vasu said, maybe we should have more of these discussions, and maybe we can take particular topics, because the African Union issues are too wide for a short meeting, but maybe we can cut them into segments and say this meeting will discuss this one and so on. But thank you very much to the International Relations Subcommittee. I think this is very important, and I enjoyed it. And thank you to all the participants and the presenters and our chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Nkosazana. Thank you, comrades. Also to Comrade Vasu and Comrade Eddie. I think we leave this colloquium very empowered. It was an eye-opener. It made us think outside the box. It made us realize some of the things that we just took for granted or just read and not engage much on. And I agree that we need more of these colloquias, I think is the right English word. But yeah, and I think within the International Relations Subcommittee, we need to encourage that and plan more on different topics. And thank each and everyone who took time to log in, to participate, or just to be here. There are other comrades who were commenting on the chat group, like Comrade Betty Govinden, Comrade Tembi Nkosi Zulu, Comrade Mika, and Comrade Mandla Matwaha. And thank you for that. Thank you. And once again, thank you for making our evening. Thank you. And wishing all a blessed evening. Thank you very much. Comrade Eddie. Thank you. I'm so happy. But maybe we need, if you have your papers, I didn't say it in the group, but I think it would be nice to send to Comrade Ndumi, so that then we can share. I for one, would love to have your inputs. It really empowered me.
Comrade Lindy, if I had a paper, then it would have been too presumptuous on my part, since I was a respondent.
I know, knowing you.